in today's talk, I try to give you a glance at some of our research we conducted at the Open University. So the recent work, mostly prominent ones, are related to how to analyze source code for software engineering. I'm sure you do a lot of software engineering at Samsung, so I hope some of the topics hit a chord, make you interested. So this work is jointly collaborated with a professor from Singapore Management University and his PhD student, or now he's just graduated, has done quite a lot of work with us on how to discover knowledge in the software source code and make use of them for various software engineering tasks. Um, so the work is basically capturing the two top conference publications we just got accepted. So actually this week is the Triple AI conference where the paper is presented around the same time by Dr. Bui to the audience on AI. And in May, roughly May or end of May, we will talk about the software engineering aspect of this work at the top conference for software engineering. Last year it was in Korea, 2020, and this year it will be in Spain. But again, it's more likely to be a virtual conference. Okay, let me carry on with the slide. Yeah. So to start with the talk, I try to give you a motivation why we are talking about deep learning. So AI has been around since the computer science, like Alan Turing suggests to use the term artificial intelligence to capture the kind of test where you can't figure out people behind the curtain, whether it's a human or a robot. If you ask the questions, you get witty answers. You can't know who is that. But recently, it picks up the people's attention in this research field called deep learning, because people are able to simulate human brains by connecting the various neurons into a network. And with a lot of data training this network, it is possible to do very sophisticated, intelligent tasks like playing the Go's with human, like AlphaGo. It got people excited that someday, at some point, there's the chance that AI will take over the intelligent task from human being. So one of the most intelligent tasks human being is doing is programming. That's not so surprising. So people who create this AlphaGo has to program it to make it work. So programming job is a very high-paid or high-paid job as well. But sadly, if AI is taken over with intelligent jobs, then programmer as a job is also disappearing. And that's my prediction. Just to be on the provocative side, later on we can have discussion on this. So in this talk, I'm trying to suggest the latest development of AI technologies in terms of programming. Um, so in this talk, I'm going first to cover the idea of how to discover knowledge from source code, which is a very fundamental part of programmer's job, is to understand other people's code. And the second part of the talk will focus on how to leverage the knowledge we discovered and to improve the various tasks for software engineering. So these are kind of hand in hand in the two topics. And later I will reserve some time so we can have a discussion on this prospect of disappearing job of programmers. Will there be a super programmers in the coming, or whether AI should be restricted and not to let it do everything for us? Okay, so the first part, let me start with the various source code we can see or we can use we can study. So previously, deep learning research has been flourishing because there's a lot of data like image, text on the internet. You can learn all that to do various intelligent jobs to answer questions. But in terms of source code, the availability is actually quite limited just a few years ago because people treat them as asset and you don't necessarily share it with another company or competitors because they are your capturing your knowledge. But as the open source movement taking shape and is getting exponentially growth, then we see that more and more people are likely to share their source code on the internet. So just this chart shows you that by 2 years ago, people already count more than 100 million repositories available for people to crawl, to learn, and to leverage. So we can call this big code as big data. And that's interesting that deep learning definitely will be a better chance to grasp or discover knowledge there. If you imagine using traditional command like grep, you can't grab so much code in a very quick way. And also that information wasn't very useful until you can capture those. So we had this Royal Society project allow us to enter into this field. Um, so just to give you an idea what it means by deep learning from source code. So if you have a human being as the developers, all the knowledge is in his memory or in his brain, and the source code is somebody else artifact or output. So what you want to do is to represent the expertise of the developers as well as the essence of the source code, and putting them together, you're able to solve a very software engineering task intelligently. So that's the vision we have. So to achieve this, we need to go a little bit deeper. So you ask the question, what is the source code? So it's a piece of text. That's not a good answer because other than this text, there are structures in it. So typically you have a nested structure, function contains method, method contains statement, statements contain operations, and so on. That structure gives people a way to navigate the source code, organize the source code, and also learn about the source code. So naturally, you can see a tree-based approach, which is the natural way of representing code instead of a sequence of tokens. And the other way to look at it is a network. So you have a variable reference another variable somewhere in another file. And in order to find out the definition of the variable or the data type of the variable, you have to navigate to much further into a different place. So graphs are another natural way of representing code. So all these natural representations are not that natural for deep learning because what is useful for neural network is to look at this, a number of signals coming in parallel to the sensor and then taking some calculation, adding weights to it, you are able to get the essence of the vector. We call it embeddings. And this information is critical. With that embedding vectors, you are able to use it for various tasks like bug detection, classification, summarization, and so on and so forth. So how to turn a tree or a graph into embedding is actually very critical for deep learning for source code. So we call this code representation problem. So there are many previous research on this topic. So I'm just giving you a clear idea what I mean the difference. So if you treat the source code as a sequence of tokens, then they are just putting these tokens in a very long sequence. And you can learn this in a natural language way. And people have a lot of language model statistically to learn the patterns from the natural language. But as I said earlier, it's not enough. We have to deal with them as if they are a tree or a graph. So they are very commonly used to analyze source code, either the syntactical structure or semantic information. So to do that, so the latest work, quite recent work in software engineering has been moving on this direction from sequence, like deep code search work 2 years ago, to the trees, where the triple AI Popple at this top conference, people are talking about how to leverage the trees. The graph is even newer. There's a more recent work this year on how to infer the data types using graph neural networks on the ICOR Language Representation Conference. Okay, so these are the boring stuff. But once you think that graph could contain more information than tree, because tree is a special case of a graph. It's just like there's no cycles, parent node decomposed to subnodes, and so on and so forth. It is actually computationally more efficient. So you don't have to use the two-dimensional calculation. It's one-dimensional, maybe 1.2, 1.5 dimensional calculation. It's very efficient to capture the source code information and so on. So we just wonder, is it really, really necessary we have to encode the graph into this computation? That's quite computationally intensive. Um, and also the limitation with graph is that you want to do all sorts of analysis on source code. And this time you're interested maybe in the class hierarchy, like which class inherent which other class. And next time you're interested in the variable reference. And yet another time, you might be interested in how the data types are citing each other. So all these different information are all graphs. And when you represent all of them as different kind of edge, your graph is loaded with a lot of information. And for your software engineering task, for one particular task, maybe you are really interested in one kind of edge, but you want to dismiss the rest of edge. So they can be noise for various different kind of machine learning task. So to do that, to avoid this getting into the trap of having a lot of noisy edges with some edge useful, some edge not useful, we have to think about, is there another way we can represent this same information without this kind of problem? So what we do is we design a tree-based model. But this is a different tree-based model compared to the previous work. We already knew that tree-based model doesn't work too well with some kind of task. So what we did was we take Hinton's recent work on capsule networks. This is a theory recently developed to overcome the challenge where convolution neural networks had. So let me show you one picture of that. So this picture shows that if you recognize human face, there's a number of features. There are eyes feature, nose feature, and the mouth feature. But using the convolution neural network for the image recognition, it does the recognition by shifting the features in parallel. So you could put the eyes next to the mouth on top of the head without a problem, because convolution neural network will bring them back to the original place. You still recognize the eyes and the mouth, but that doesn't make sense anymore. So if you ask your kid to draw someone's head and putting the mouth on the top of the head, nose at the bottom, which used to be the jaws, then this doesn't make sense as human's face. It just, the algorithm couldn't tell the difference. So by this intuition, the capsule network is trying to treat different features as a knowledge capsule. And you want to learn the relationship between different capsules by looking at how they route information from one place to another. So the semantic relationship or the relative location of different features is actually captured by the capsule networks. So that's all good. It's actually working quite well for image recognition. But remember, we are doing a different task. We are trying to learn the hierarchical structure of source code. So instead of treat it as an image, we have to treat it as a hierarchical information. And that's the hard bit. So abstract syntax trees, for example, is the underlying uh, uh, representation of data structure for the source code. How do we learn the relationship between the nodes without explicitly analyze the relationship? The challenge is now introduced. The solution is actually quite uh, how to say, quite a bit mathematics in there. So I try to be a little bit simple, just to give you the high level ideas, what the transformation metric is. So imagine that you are doing the convolutional learning. So you shift the features on the image from one place to another. That's called displacement. So it's not a huge transformation there. But if you consider an arbitrary matrix doing the transformation, either rotation or elasting or shrinking, all this kind of transformation can be captured by a matrix. And the matrix role here is to uh, turn out or learned all this semantic information, those implicit relationship between the nodes. So just give you a kind of a mental idea about this capsule networks. So basically you can treat the features a little cell with some color. And then when you do the embedding, you turn the number of cells into one single vector of different cells. And to do this hierarchically, we basically need to introduce this routing algorithm as captured by the transformation matrix. So multiple levels or multiple size of the vectors is reduced into a smaller set of vectors and even further smaller and into single vectors. So in the end, you get the same code embedding, but that embedding has already taken into account the intermediate different routing relationship between the feature vectors. Um, so the other idea we leverage is the so-called variable to static routing. If you work on the networking, you probably know that the routing is very flexible. You can uh, connect or disconnect certain nodes when the network congestion is there. So here we just take this analogy. We are not going to allow this variable number of nodes to connect to each other because that's making the computation untractable. So what we do is we actually decide in the end, the last layer of the network, it will be a fixed number of routing nodes. So you get a rather tractable computation to leverage the embeddings. So it's like in the end, we get the fixed size of the vectors for the code. No matter whether you're doing different software engineering tasks, you have the same vector to use. So that saves a lot of extra computations for another task to be added. So actually the second part, I will talk about this. So these are just the numbers you can see from the papers. I just put in a few tables to illustrate the point, how much improvement this can make. So this data set came from Peking University in China. They are teaching a programming class. So over the years, they did 104 questions for students, and each question they get 500 answers. So these are university students' term papers. So the quality is quite good compared to just randomly crawl data from GitHub. So that gets into a benchmark for everyone to use to evaluate the deep learning, deep code learning work in terms of performance. So in the table, we just show that the TreeCaps, so the hierarchical capsule networks approach is actually better than the previous ones. So the previous ones, this is using sequence like recurrent neural networks. These ones using trees. This one use graph. This one use subtrees. Again, similar to the two work previously. But you can see that the outcome is pretty good. The second data set is Java. So, well, academics, we typically collect a lot of Java methods. So in this task, we are trying to predict the names of the method by learning the internal structure of the code. So you can imagine this is easily gets wrong. It's not easy to get it right, but it turns out that a lot of case you get about half better than random guess. And the other work also apply to this because as I said before, any way you can embedding a code into a vector, you are able to use it for various different tasks. This is the second task we tried. It again introduce better precision recall performance for the function name prediction task. Yeah, the evaluation shows you the pros and cons. The pros is that the performance in terms of the task is getting better, but the cons or the disadvantage is that the TreeCaps network is a little bit demanding for the computation because there are larger number of parameters here to play with. And the other challenge is to interpret the result to people. Because you said this performance is good, but why is good? AI at the moment can't easily give you a quick answer to that. It just sounds like a magic to people. Um, okay, so the second part of the talk, I won't take question now, so I will leave all the question to the end, just to give you some idea of how this embedding, when we learn from large amount of source code, can be applied to various software engineering tasks. So here is the examples we want to show. But before that, I first introduce a little bit more theoretical progress for this work. So previously we said, okay, let's take a vector representing the code, just like a vector representing a document. So that can help people search for information or doing various things. But the interesting part of doc to vector work in the natural language processing field is that when you train a model with a lot of data, the vector becomes so much more reusable. And for the rest of the task, you don't need to feed me a lot of code or a lot of documents anymore. I can just reuse the vector I learned and make a few fine tuning to adjust the vectors by some downstream task. That's the same idea we used. So instead of we use the traditional vector, doctor vector work for natural language, we just apply the tree-based CNN encoder we just investigated previously and to get a vector. This time we just make sure we get a lot of code as the input. We have to learn as much code as we could so that the model we learned can be used for so many other tasks. So the inspiration here is like when you have a tree, you treat each subtree as something replaceable, something like you can unplug and replug something else. So that way you can see it as if this is a document with a lot of tokens, but instead of their tokens, they are subtrees. So that's the insight we have on how to build a stable, rather reusable intermediate representation for code embedding. And this is the work we leverage. So again, with the attention layer, again, it's kind of hard to explain what the attention is. It's basically when you're doing learning, you want to keep your attention on the interesting, exciting bits. So you have more focused study on the concepts. Here's the same. When you learn the source code, instead of wasting all your energy on all tokens in the code, but putting all your attention to the relevant bits that are really tell the difference in the learning. So that's where the attention model can improve the performance for computation. Other than that, it's just the tree-based CAN neural network model. So conceptually, this is how it's applied. When we learned a lot of unlabeled data, people don't need to mark what the data is. So previously, we say 52,000 104 class for 52,000 instance of code. But in this pretext task, you don't need to tell me which algorithm, which class of algorithm this code is. As long as I know they are code, that's enough. So we just feed all this data into the encoder until we get to the point where the downstream task is clear to you. So for example, the downstream task could be, tell me which class out of this 104 is this program about, and could be something else. So that's how this would work across the board in various software engineering tasks. So again, the clustering is one typical applications. When you have hundreds of thousands methods, you want to know which groups of methods are related in order to classify them. So in this case, you don't know the labels of the class. It's just because they are similar, they should be belong together. So clustering is very commonly used techniques for fundamental program understanding task. So again, we just show that, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, our techniques is given the name InferCode, which is basically telling all the previous invention we had. So basically, InferCode applied to this task give you amazingly high performance compared to the other examples, other code embeddings. The second task you can imagine is clone detection. So a lot of times you do a copy paste. So this piece of code, just copy it and paste it elsewhere. And copy paste is a bad practice, but sometimes it's unavoidable under time pressure. So a lot of times you end up with a very large code base, but many parts are actually clones to each other. If you modify one of them without touching the other one, there will be inconsistency among them. So clone detection gives you an opportunity to verify or validate which part of the code is actually a copy of another part of the code. So this is traditionally people use syntax, semantics, all sort of program analysis to get a better hold of clone detection. Using InferCode, we compare to the very well-known clone detectors, it's outperformed most of them. So the third one, just give you another idea, is code search. So this is something like you search on the GitHub to look for a certain piece of code answering your question. But this is more than that. So instead of using keywords to search the code, you actually already fill the code halfly, maybe first three statement has been written. All you need is the next five statements. So in this case, you can feed the first half of the code into the magic library, and it returns you the code that can fill the rest of the implementation. So a lot of AI startups are actually creating tools for the integrated development environment. So you can be lazy, for example. But this is the early phase. The programmer can get lazy, but in the future, the program job will be gone because the AI can fill the whole source code for you, and you don't need to do anything anymore. But that's to be discussed. So that work, we show that this InferCode has made some progress in across 4 different language code search problems. So Java, C Sharp, they all benefit from these techniques. Okay, so the other 2 tasks we show in the papers are the code classification task. I already mentioned the previous paper. And then the method name prediction task, I also mentioned in the previous paper. These are the 2 tasks we already evaluated, but this is just reiterate. So having this capability, you can suggest a algorithm So if people give you a bubble sort algorithm, you detect the algorithm is bubble sort, and your library shows you there's other more efficient implementation of sorting algorithm like quicksort, then the algorithm detection can go further to say, let's replace your inefficient code with the more efficient one. And then you get performance boost for the implementation. And that's just one single example of how this can be used. It could be used elsewhere as a patch. Someone said, oh, there's a vulnerability in your code. Can you patch it? You said, oh yeah, I recognize this vulnerability relate to uh, a null pointer exception. I know how to deal with this from the previous code base. So let me just pull out the similar code and you replace the problematic code. Then you get a patch done for you. So all these mundane software engineering tasks could be done later with AI, at least with the help of AI. So that's quite impressive. Seeing this is the promising direction. I just give you some nice picture to show having the more properly done language embedding, you can separate the different bits better. So they are actually really relate to each other, things are clustered together. But if you use the other algorithms in the baselines, their clustering job isn't so perfect. So you still have to look into it to see how to separate them from each other. Um, so yeah, this give you a initial point to consider these questions. So these are the thoughts. I just put them kind of randomly, but I guess the first four questions get a clear yes answer according to what we have seen in the literature. The second set of questions, my answer to them are maybe, because you might lose your job eventually, but maybe you get a different creative jobs elsewhere. So it's hard to know. But programmer as a job is getting um, replaced, or at least a large part of that can be replaced by AI. And if you go maybe 10 years later or 20 years later, we can start to worry about it now, because if the job created has been replaced by AI, but AI is doing the evil things, then that's a bit something you really need to worry.